What if a single sentence, spoken by a black congresswoman in a room full of global power, was enough to make one of Africa's toughest presidents go completely silent and shed a tear? This isn't a speech, it's a reckoning. And once you hear what Jasmine Crockett said, you'll never look at history, or yourself, the same way again. Stay with me. Dear friends, what you're about to hear is more than just a story. It's a glimpse into a world where quiet courage reshapes destinies and dignity outshines power. These are the voices often missed by the headlines, but not here. If this kind of storytelling moves you, if it stays with you long after the screen fades, we invite you to subscribe and ring the bell. And before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. We read every word. Now let's begin. No one expected the room to fall silent, not during the closing moments of a diplomatic summit in Geneva, not with presidents and ministers still flipping through their final talking points. And certainly not because of her. Jasmine Crockett, a first-term congresswoman from the United States, wasn't even listed on the speaking schedule. She'd been seated in the back, unacknowledged, a silent guest among heads of state and seasoned diplomats. But when she stood, without preamble, without permission, and spoke just 92 words, the room forgot how to breathe. Ibrahim Traoré, the African president known across continents for his unshakable poise, did not respond. This was the man who had once stood unfazed before tanks, who had delivered speeches through tear gas and war drums. A man whose defiance had become doctrine. And yet, faced with the quiet certainty in Jasmine's voice, he sat down slowly, lowered his eyes to the floor, and did not speak. The silence that followed was not one of tension, but recognition, an ancient kind of stillness. A hush that stretched for 11 seconds, long enough to make history pause and take a breath. No one moved. Even the translators, normally immune to emotion, removed their headsets. No one dared break what had just been formed, an invisible thread between continents, time, and memory. She hadn't spoken loudly, she hadn't postured or pointed fingers. She simply said, "Mr. President, I didn't come to challenge you, I came to return." That was all, but in those few words, she collapsed centuries of separation. Her voice didn't carry the cadence of politics, it carried inheritance. It carried a reckoning, and that's what made it devastating. No applause followed, no reporters jumped to their feet. The cameras didn't pan dramatically, because some moments aren't for performance, they're for remembering. Jasmine Crockett wasn't there as a headline, she was there as a haunting reminder of bloodlines once erased, now refusing to remain silent. That day, in the cold elegance of a Geneva conference hall, something happened that couldn't be planned or replicated. A daughter of the diaspora returned, not with fanfare, but with a whisper. And in response, one of the strongest men in modern African politics was brought to tears. What truth did she carry? What silence did she break? The world had no choice but to keep listening. Long before he became the face of African resistance, before his name echoed through the marble halls of the United Nations, Ibrahim Traoré was a boy who walked barefoot through the dusty outskirts of Bamako, Mali, with more questions than answers and not nearly enough food. His mother sold beans wrapped in newspaper. His father delivered mail on a rusted bicycle and taught him that ink, not bullets, was the most dangerous weapon a poor man could wield. Ibrahim didn't grow up with power. He grew up with silence, the kind that coated every conversation about colonialism, every mention of relatives who had vanished without graves or photographs. He once dreamed of becoming a teacher, someone who could rewrite what history books had erased. But dreams, in his world, were for those with full stomachs. By 15, he was carrying a weapon. By 23, he was the youngest officer in his unit. By 30, he was a strategist hiding messages inside poetry and memorizing maps the way his grandmother once memorized psalms. His rise wasn't meteoric, it was forged, hardened through betrayals, exile, and long nights pacing dirt floors under flickering oil lamps, wondering if justice was still a word that meant something. The world saw a defiant president when he took power, but they didn't see the man who had whispered to himself in candlelight, who had wept silently after ordering evacuations that came too late, or who had sat in military briefings thinking of children sleeping on concrete floors. Ibrahim didn't seek leadership. He answered to something deeper, a debt to the voiceless, the buried, the erased. When he addressed the UN, he didn't read from teleprompters. He looked into the eyes of delegates who called Africa developing while mining its land raw. "We are not a problem to solve," he once said. "We are a memory you're trying to forget." That sentence was not a threat. It was a wound laid bare. He didn't smile for cameras, he didn't chase applause, but he was feared, not because of what he might do, but because of what he might make others remember, and that made him dangerous. Until Jasmine Crockett stood before him in Geneva, no one had managed to do what centuries of imperial pressure and political isolation could not: stop him in his tracks, because power recognizes truth. And that day, Ibrahim Traoré met a truth older than politics, a truth that didn't want control, it wanted acknowledgement. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into the Geneva summit as a spectacle. There were no flashing cameras chasing her, no murmurs of anticipation rippling through the room. She wasn't even announced. She arrived with a navy blue suit, a well-worn leather notebook pressed against her side, and the calm gravity of someone who knew exactly why she was there, even if no one else did. Her name wasn't on the agenda. She wasn't scheduled to speak, but history doesn't always wait for invitations. There was something in the way she moved, the way her eyes scanned the brass nameplates at each delegate's seat, not with awe, but with recognition. She didn't come to ask for space, she carried her own. Her presence didn't demand attention, yet it reshaped the room. Some thought she was a junior aide, others assumed she was observing, shadowing someone else's power. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't crossed an ocean to observe. She had come to remember out loud. She waited until the session was nearly closed, when the final remarks were being shuffled through and diplomats were already packing their notes and devices. Then she stood. No fanfare, no raised hand. She simply rose from her chair and walked forward as though her name had always been etched into the stone of that room. A few turned their heads, puzzled. The moderator blinked, unsure. But something unspoken in her step stopped anyone from intervening. Her voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It didn't rise to fill the space. It filled it because of what it carried. She spoke not like a politician, not even like a reformer. She spoke like a daughter of stories never written down, of names lost in ship manifests and auction ledgers, of lullabies hummed into chains. And in 92 words, she collapsed oceans. "Mr. President, I didn't come to challenge you. I came to return." She didn't ask to be welcomed. She wasn't looking for agreement. She brought nothing but the memory of those who could not speak for themselves. She didn't raise a fist or point a finger. She remembered. And in doing so, she asked everyone present to remember too, not the statistics, not the treaties, but the humanity that had been buried under them. There was no performance in her voice, no weapon, just clarity. And sometimes clarity is more powerful than rage. What Jasmine said didn't just surprise the room, it unmoored it, because there, in the polished heart of a summit, built on protocol and hierarchy, a woman no one expected to speak, told the truth no one else knew how to say. She wasn't invited, but she came anyway, because home, even after centuries of exile, doesn't wait for permission. The room had emptied. Delegates filed out with the quiet urgency of people unsure how to process what they had just witnessed. No official statements had been made, no cameras were rolling. Yet something irreversible had passed through the air, and everyone who had been present could feel it clinging to their skin. But behind closed doors, in a small room away from the main chamber, two figures remained. Jasmine Crockett sat across from Ibrahim Traoré. Gone were the barriers of nation and title. There were no nameplates between them, no advisors whispering in ears. Just two people, one the daughter of the displaced, the other the son of the soil, sharing a silence that felt older than both of them. Traoré, who had spent his life mastering rhetoric, now found himself groping for words. His voice, when it finally broke the quiet, was soft and uneven. "You didn't sound like America," he said. "You sounded like home." It wasn't a compliment, it was a confession, one he hadn't expected to make, one he hadn't even known he was carrying. Jasmine didn't respond immediately. She let the words settle between them like dust. Then she said, almost too quietly, "I've never felt fully American, but I've never been allowed to be African either." She didn't say it with bitterness. She said it with a kind of grief that had no country to attach itself to. It was the ache of being born in between, too far from the motherland to claim it, too rejected by her own country to feel owned by it. They looked at each other, and in that look was a recognition neither of them had ever been offered in a political space. The divide between them wasn't cultural or diplomatic. It was historical. And in that moment, it narrowed. No grand speeches followed. No deals were brokered. What passed between them was something far more sacred: understanding. Jasmine wasn't asking to belong. She was acknowledging that something had always belonged to her, even if it had been stolen, renamed, and scattered across centuries. And Traoré, for the first time, saw the other side of a wound he'd always believed was only his to bear. He had spent his life defending Africa's present. Jasmine had just reminded him of Africa's diaspora, its living memory, scattered but not lost. And as he listened, he didn't see a politician or a visitor. He saw family. That night, no history books were updated, but history shifted. Two timelines, long severed, touched again, not with politics, not with policy, but with presence. Two histories, one wound, and for the first time they sat in the same room and let it speak. In the weeks that followed the summit, the world returned to its noise. Press cycles moved on, governments released statements that said little, and analysts tried to frame what had happened in terms of diplomacy and geopolitics. But those who had been in that room knew something else had occurred, something that couldn't be measured by headlines or recaps, something that didn't need to trend to take root. For President Ibrahim Traoré, the moment didn't end when the applause faded. It began again in the silence of his own reflection. He called a private council, not to draft policy, but to create something more enduring, a network of truth halls, community spaces across Burkina Faso and beyond, where young Africans could sit with elders and listen to the histories never written down. No textbooks, no sanitized timelines, just stories told by firelight in courtyards and schools, reclaiming what was erased. "Power," he said, during the first opening in Bobo Dioulasso, "is not in what we build, it's in what we remember." Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett returned to Washington different. She had left for Geneva as a congresswoman. She returned as something larger, a vessel for voices long buried beneath policy and ash, and she knew her work couldn't stay confined to the chambers of Capitol Hill. With quiet determination, she launched the Bridges of Return initiative, a transatlantic fellowship for Black youth in America to reconnect with African communities, not through charity or tourism, but through shared legacy. The program paired students with families across West Africa, scholars with griots, activists with farmers, reweaving the lineage that slavery tried to sever. Her first speech after the summit wasn't in Congress, it was at a middle school auditorium in Baltimore. She didn't bring notes, she brought the same leather notebook she had carried into Geneva. Holding it in her hands, she said to a room of wide-eyed teenagers, "We weren't taken to disappear. We were taken so that one day we would return. And now we do." The quote spread not because it was poetic, but because it was undeniable, printed in 23 languages, etched onto murals, sung at vigils and marches, whispered at kitchen tables. It wasn't a slogan, it was a compass. What Jasmine and Ibrahim began wasn't about healing a wound overnight. It was about naming it, holding it, letting the scar breathe in the open air so that others could see it and say, "Yes, that happened, and we're still here." From memory, they didn't just rebuild, they reconnected, not as leaders, as descendants, not for power, for presence, not to forget, but to finally come home. What began as a quiet summit in Geneva unfolded into one of the most powerful reckonings in modern political memory. Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman no one expected to speak, became the voice that bridged centuries of silence. And Ibrahim Traoré, a president forged in the fires of revolution and resolve, was moved not by force, but by a single sentence spoken with clarity, with love, and with memory. Their meeting was not a headline, it was a return. A return to stories that had been scattered by ships and stitched into shadows. A return to names whispered only in prayer. A return to the truth that some wounds, no matter how old, still ache until they are acknowledged. Jasmine didn't travel to Geneva to be seen. She went because her ancestors had never been given the chance to finish their story. She went because memory, if not spoken, risks extinction. And when she said, "We weren't taken to disappear, we were taken to return," she wasn't offering comfort. She was declaring a birthright. Ibrahim Traoré didn't respond with rhetoric. He responded with silence, with a tear, with an understanding that leadership is not about being unmoved, but about being moved by what matters. His legacy, once rooted in resistance, expanded that day to include remembrance. From that encounter, new bridges were built, literal and symbolic. Jasmine created paths for American youth to find their lineage. Ibrahim founded halls of memory for African youth to find their truth. Together, they didn't just exchange words, they exchanged direction. Not just between two people, but between two continents long separated and ready to reconnect. The lesson is simple, yet profound. Sometimes history doesn't need to be rewritten. It needs to be re-spoken, out loud, by those who carry it in their bones. Jasmine's courage teaches us that truth does not need volume to be powerful, and Traoré's response reminds us that strength is not measured by how much you resist emotion, but by how deeply you allow it to guide you. So, what does this mean for us today? It means your story matters, even if no one has asked for it yet. It means silence doesn't protect legacy, voice does, and it means that the journey to healing doesn't begin when someone gives you permission to speak. It begins the moment you remember why you must. Now here's a question for you. Which line was spoken by Jasmine Crockett during the Geneva summit? A. We weren't taken to disappear, we were taken to return. B. Africa must accept its past before it can move forward. Comment your answer below. A or B? Let's see who's really listening. And tell us what part of this story moved you the most. What did it make you feel, reflect, or remember? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your perspective too. If this story stirred something in you, don't just scroll away. Subscribe to the channel, hit that bell icon, and help us keep these stories alive, because when we listen deeply, we grow together, and when we remember together, we rise.